an interesting chance to try this out. The one thing that I wanted to suggest, and this applies to Luis and will apply to others, Alexandra, who sick, unfortunately, is COVID today.
Yeah.
But it will apply to all of you. Is that please, in subsets, try to think about what that you're dealing with and how your case develops. We talked about that a little bit with Adam. So this, I'm not bringing it on. It will always be an issue. So, I almost take your title and a popular movement that you have some that seriously enough. So, obviously, the linking to the literature is something that would actually to make an effort. So the way we do it is you talk first. I don't know how long you.
30 minutes.
30 minutes. And then I will comment, maybe for 30 minutes, depending on the issues that come up. Maximum 30 minutes, and then the rest is for discussion. But I could be short. But please, Adam, yeah. Oh, you know what? Let me put in my ear. And of course, you tape it again.
Yes.
Not only Alexandra, but another student is also absent.
Yes.
The video side of it. The presentation has 6 parts. I want to start out with talking about what democracy means, if the US is a democracy, what it would mean for its decline. Then I want to focus on 2 specific moments where democracy might have been in breakdown. I'm really thinking about the Trump period, 2016 through 2020, and I'm going to be specifically focusing on Trump's electoral challenge from November 2020 through January 2021, and then also the attack on the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. So this is a much more zoomed in focus than we've traditionally taken that has sort of methodological issues that
in my global analysis is the best approach to state for US democracy. And then I want to talk about the democracy structure. Here on the using lenses broadly compared to this approach.
best case by other cases might have. And then the last point, I want to think about this idea of the coup on January 6th and coups more generally as a sort of representation of democracy. This is a sort of different argument. This departs from Lin's and brings us back to the before reading at the very beginning. Yes, so we'll go step by step. The first idea here is about what democracy is. Is US democracy, what are we doing? I think there's 3 really compelling approaches. The first is the approach taken by Lin's, as well as by Rubinstein and Black. I think it's a starting point and as a non-negotiable argument that the US is, of course, a democracy. Right? This claim rests on the idea that across the world, the US has sort of inspired democracy. There's been at the forefront of the movement. There may have been particular small moments of regress or moments of breakdown, but there's always sort of an unflinching commitment to democratic principles that is not present in other regions. If you look at the Lin's reading, the only times he ever invokes the US is very briefly in a few sentences where he says, and of course this is what stability looks like. Now let's get back to the matter at hand. Right? Before Trump and before January 6th, it's really remarkable just how absolutely people believe US is democracy. I think the second approach is this idea that democracy is ruined by forces like neoliberalism, anti-blackness, and settler colonialism. I think the most developed version of this claim comes from Andreas Klivas in our politics department. And his argument specifically focuses on neoliberalism, but the more general claim is that democracy internally contains a certain crisis, a certain break, or a certain opening. He's really 100% following Laforte here, right? His claim is that there wasn't a perfect democracy or a stable democracy that suddenly got ruined. Rather, democracy has always been something shaky, always been something unstable. So we can't imagine that sort of before. The second argument in this train of thought is articulated really well by the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is that the U.S. is in some way anchored in a tradition of anti-blackness or settler colonialism that violates and breaks down any of the democratic ideals we may have once had. Right, the idea is that the U.S. is in some way predicated on the removal of natives, on violence against slaves, and that when we imagined ourselves as creating a constitution, as creating a democratic relationship with citizens, what we were actually doing was creating a sort of foundation of violence that we've never gotten over. This is a remarkably pessimistic approach. And I think the conclusion of it says that we can't be in a state of breakdown because there is nothing to break down. There was no point of achievement to sort of fall from. We always were at ground zero. We were always at the bottom. You made a fantasy that we were up here, and maybe we followed from that. But it's a very pessimistic approach. Coates and Kalibas don't agree, but I think they make the same flawed conclusion of, hey, let's back up. We're not actually in a crisis. I think the most compelling argument, and the one that I want to follow, is the argument made by Robert Dahl, and I think Andrew has echoed this a few times, which is that there is a sort of ideal democracy. So Dahl's argument is that we don't have ideal democracy, we actually have polyarchy. We actually have rule by multiple people, and this achieves some of democracy's ideals, but we never achieve this perfect embodiment of true democracy. We never achieve what the murals in the White House depict, for example. The claim there is that we can still have meaningful democratic values, and we can still have forms of institutions, forms of relating to each other, forms of organizing the citizenry that still embody democracy, even if there is some moment of breakdown. I think what this does is it's a more reasonable analysis than the first, and it takes seriously this critique, but it still allows us to think that the US is a proper democracy, and it still allows us to take seriously the idea that there's some breakdown that's going to happen. One way to sort of oversimplify Dahl's argument would be that we falsely believe we're at 100%, we're actually at 80%, which means the fall from 80% to 60% is meaningful, even if you were never at 100, right? There's some breakdown, that breakdown matters. There's an interesting result in thinking like this, which is that all of these approaches, both of these two approaches require that we take seriously the idea that the US might not be a democracy, or might not be a true democracy anymore. And this is a really humiliating argument to take seriously. This claim that what was once the beacon of democracy is now just a sort of case among others. It's just as undemocratic as a lot of other regions. I think it requires a lot of humility, and more seriously, it requires we might lose the focal point of our references. We might lose the object that we thought was so solid, was so 100% democratic, to judge things according to. So if we lose that reference point, we're sort of searching for something else. I think some critics would say, okay, well, you look at somewhere like Norway, that's the new beacon of democracy. Or you look at smaller communities that are more democratic. But I think there's a sort of provocative question of what it means to lose that reference. But for the purposes of the presentation, I'm generally taking this approach and thinking there is some breakdown, even if there wasn't a perfect moment of origin. So now I want to think about the health of US democracy, applying that previous slide to the US specifically. I think there's three reasons to suspect that the US might be in a state of democratic breakdown. The first, and I think this is the most persuasive, is that partisan bodies have recognized the US has fallen to some degree. So the EIU Democracy Index recently released a report at the end of 2022. The US fell from the category of perfect democracy or an ideal democracy to a flawed democracy. It's now around 8 out of 10 on its ranking scale. And it's among other countries that previously would not have thought to be of the level of the US. It's, again, the Tigris firm, I said 7.85. A similar argument is made by the Fitch Credit Rankings, which is a credit institution trying to determine the sort of confidence you can have in investing in certain countries. The Fitch Credit Union, Fitch Credit Rankings, shifted the US from an AAA to an AA++. This is again a move to say it's imperfect, we've fallen from somewhere, there's something wrong. And the Fitch Credit Ranking explicitly references January 6th as a moment that caused the sufficient suspicion, that made things really problematic. Part of their argument is about the oncoming government shutdown and about debts of China that we don't really need to get into. But there is still something here about an objective measure, the democracy is sort of in crisis. The second argument is about Trump specifically. This is the argument that 40,000 academics have written books about, say, the current state of the American left, the current state of American politics. Trump, insert horrible adjective, right? They're very polemic, they're very exciting. Every political scientist. I think there's two that get the argument quite nicely. The first is Amy Siskin's book, The List. This is a gargantuan book, about 600 or 700 pages, that tries to compile each and every one of Donald Trump's violations of norms over his first year. And it gives about 1 or 2 sentences to each of them, and it takes her about 700 pages to get through it all. And the idea there is to show the overwhelming depth of just how much he has violated American rights. The fact that she could not get it all together, I think what speaks to it. The other argument is by Robin Wagner-Petskensy, who was previously a member of our Citizens Department. And her claim is very similar to a lot of others, which is that Trump has something unprecedented about it. There's something that we couldn't have predicted. That was never the case in American politics. works that he has somehow introduced. And she gets into a discussion about temporality that again we don't get into, but she's representative of that general school of thought. This would follow Linz's approach, and it's very actor-centric, but it takes it to an extreme, where it's a single individual that's the focal point of how politics works. It takes things like media very seriously, it takes sound bites very seriously, and treats that as the proof of the symptom of American democracy. This is not getting into things like voter disenfranchisement. The last claim is about January 6th. This is the one that I'm most persuaded by. This is the argument that I think the book that I'm passing around makes, the book about January 6th, which is a claim that something serious happened on that winter day. There was something of absolute evil. There was some genuine horrible sin that occurred when people stormed the Capitol that can't quite be comprehended. That shows the absolute evil of the Trump. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, famously said that it was the darkest day in American history. Kind of insane, given that we dropped nuclear bombs on people against slavery, right? There's a lot of other things that could qualify for that, but her claim is that it somehow represents the moment of absolute evil. Let me say two more things. Regarding this Trump argument, I think this overemphasizes the singular individual, but there's a very compelling argument here that analysis of Trump as violating democratic norms really gets at the essential relationship between egalitarianism and democracy. The basic idea that there is a foundation of respect and equality that we hold for others, that there's a certain way we shape our communities that Trump has somehow violated. I think the most explicit example of this is Hillary Clinton's attack ad back in 2016, titled Mirrors. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but this was a 30-second piece, very popular, where women appeared on screen in front of mirrors, looking at themselves, with Trump's words about women written over their bodies. So it was Trump speaking about how much he wanted to rape women, how he saw them as ugly, as fat, as slobbish. And it was daughters, it was wives, it was women in the community that had those words pictured on their bodies. That attack ad by all signs failed. It didn't resonate with Republicans. But it shows something about just how much Trump violated those norms. This is also an approach that Linz doesn't let us get to. Linz, at multiple points in the volume, explicitly rejects the focus of democratic values, about structures and processes. He departs from that Tocquevillian perspective, thinking about the ways of life. So from this, we know that there's some democracy that might be in peril. There might be a moment of breakdown. From this, we see that the U.S. fits into that model. The U.S. is sort of in a state of breakdown. I now want to focus on two moments of breakdown that anchor that analysis. The first is the electoral challenge. So in the reading that I shared with you guys, Trump claims that he won the election, right? He says, as everybody saw, we won by historic numbers. He says, we want an honest election. We want an honest count. We want honest people working back there. It's a very important job. You can imagine in parentheses what he's saying is the election right now is dishonest. Things are not going the way they should be going. This is what's commonly called the big lie. This is what a lot of this January 6th report spends its time on, breaking down how the big lie works. The argument follows a few basic claims. It's some combination of the argument that mail-in ballots are a sham. They somehow screw over normal voters. The argument that election workers are manipulating votes, right? They're stealing boxes. Famously, there's a claim that votes are put into a box, and then some devilish election worker takes the box, puts it under the table, then it's magically never seen again. And Trump's argument is, of course, that's where the deep state comes in, sort of grimy hands, sort of touch things. The next claim is that dead people are voting, that your votes as an honest American are being stolen by these dead people that are voting for Democrats. Democrats are manipulating the vote that way. And then the fourth argument is the blue wave is a lie, that this huge onslaught or this huge wave of leftist voters that are reacting to Trump doesn't actually happen. In fact, the majority of the country, in Trump's explanation, loves him. It's part of the far right. He actually represents the people. And these are overwhelmingly proven false. There's very, very little basis for the big lie claim. This is really clearly found in his overwhelming failure reports. Trump has lost 61, 62 cases where he tried to challenge it. In the one case that he won, it was a very, very small victory. It was clerical error. It showed no signs of actual manipulation. There isn't really a basis to believe this is real. Of course, we know that's right. So much of Trump's campaign has been self-dependency. There's no argument that he's turned based on real. But in terms of Linz, you're going to hear is that Trump is violating the rules of the game. He's violating the basic norms of how democracy works. He doesn't allow for votes to. He doesn't allow for the election to go as it should. He doesn't allow for normal people to vote. He breaks down democracy. So this is an account of how Trump is undemocratic, but it isn't an account of why democratic breakdown did or didn't work. This doesn't quite explain how we got there or why we got there. This is sort of an explanation of the end. Another key point in the election challenge surrounds the 12th Amendment. This is another point where Trump is trying to make a legal claim that has essentially no grounds. The argument essentially goes that Vice President Mike Pence has power to reject electoral votes on January 6th, during the day when the electoral votes are supposed to be confirmed. This all relies on a misreading of the Senate, which says the President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate House of Representatives, open all certificates and votes shall then be counted. It's a verb of open all certificates. This is traditionally understood by scholars of the U.S. Constitution as being a purely symbolic rule, a moment of opening a ceremony, like a lot of other officials do. The argument by Trump and his lawyers is that this is a formal decision that the Vice President gets to make. And if Pence wants to, he can choose to not open the certificates and instead send them back to the states. Again, this is something that has zero support in terms of scholarly law. Trump's lawyers are really, really weird. They're not received well by other lawyers. This is an example of 6 or 7 people in a private room in the White House scheming over something and making their own decision about how things work. Again, it's a violation of the normal rules. But there's one other way that Trump's electoral challenge violates Lindsay's law. And this is the call on violence. Even before January 6th, there's an explicit move made by Trump to try to do violence to people. In an unreleased draft, in an unreleased executive order, Trump says, effective immediately, the Secretary of Defense shall seize, collect, retain, and analyze all machines, equipment, electronically stored information, and material records required for retention under consent. This is a dystopian move. This is an explicit moment where the military is called in to take voting machines, bring them back, fix them, and then return them. This is the end of American democracy. This doesn't actually happen, right? What does happen is a huge amount of intimidation and violence against election workers. There's some really wonderful news reporting that goes through this, and finds text message conversations, Facebook messages, mail that threatens election workers with torture, with rape, with harassment, with kidnapping, horrible, horrible things. The point here is that Trump is doing this. Trump is responding to a democratic procedure of the election going as normal and saying that we need to harass and do violence against election workers. Now, Lynn's sort of uses a way to think about it. Lynn's never said explicitly that violence is somehow undemocratic. Lynn's key argument about violence relates to the military, and especially to paramilitary organizations. His argument is that, if I understand it correctly, is that when there's paramilitary organizations, they call into question the legitimacy of the state to have a monopoly over violence. They create a sort of an alternative force that people can have faith in, undermines claims of legitimacy. None of this ever reaches that level. There is no paramilitary organization, certainly before January 6th, comes up. What we instead see is just an explicit move to call on individuals to be violent. So I think this makes a less developed argument that just says Trump tried to use violence. Violence is somehow anti-democratic. It doesn't quite get to it.
I'll make it clear, this executive order is something he wrote down,
Yes.
but did not give it to anybody to act on, right?
Yes.
So it's among his papers. But that's all there is.
It was found by the January 6th committee.
We have really no idea if anybody would obey at the actual.
There isn't a crucial moment of the military facing Trump.
But he's commander-in-chief technically, but this is also, pretty on the face of it illegal order.
Yeah, right. But you're right. This is a really clear moment where fragmentation could have occurred had it happened. It's very easy to imagine a loyal contingent of the military and a disloyal contingent of the military breaking on this order.
Yeah.
That would have allowed us to plug this into Lindsay's model, but it doesn't happen. And there's just interesting questions about why it doesn't happen. From my understanding, it's a question of lawyers' advice, but there's not a lot of information about why this is happening.
Well, does anybody know if his lawyers gave an opinion on this particular?
his lawyers helped him draft it. Beyond that, I don't know.
So some lawyers have to.
Do you know what the Title 42 sections is? Like, do you know what the United States Code Title 42 sections, like,
Hold on here. It references the ability for the military to seize voting machines if there's something horribly wrong. It's a very, very exceptional code. It's only, I don't think it's ever been one of these things where it's outdated, it doesn't make sense. Okay, so we have one approach,
Because
right?
that would be the legal title under which the rest of the country works.
Yeah.
And, well, I guess we have to look at.
the fact that it exists is still worrying.
Okay, so we have one case, right? We have November 2020 through January 2021 attack on elections. This undemocratic move that's potentially evidence of democratic breakdown. I now want to talk about the second case, which is the attack on the U.S. Capitol. You're going to hear there's a few arguments here. The first is quite obvious, which is that it's an explicit interruption of the transition of power. It's a moment where someone loses and refuses to leave office. Again, a violation of the basic rules of the game. It's also an introduction to threats of violence. The book shows this really, really clearly. Attackers on January 6th, at Trump's command, attempt to do violence to Capitol police officers, to members of the Senate, to members of Congress. They even bring a galley or a gallow to potentially execute Mike Pence. Right? There's an explicit threat of violence, violating the rules of the game. The key point, though, I think that's more important is the fragmentation of the Republican Party around January 6th. It's the breaking up of the once loyal party into something that's semi-loyal, loyal, and distant. So Linz, if you remember, says that loyalty to democracy is a public commitment to the legal means for gaining power and rejection of the use of force. So here we have a violation of both of those. But if you also remember, Linz's argument is that semi-loyal actors, they're the ones that sort of determine everything. You imagine it, you can almost imagine one of those children's games called when it's like this. When a child sits on either side and goes back and forth. What's that called? A seesaw. If you imagine a seesaw, you have the loyal on one side, the semi-loyal on the other. Then you have a child sitting in the middle, deciding which way to go. I think that's sort of Linz's argument, that the child can decide which way to go and determine the consequences. Because the child on one side or the other will surely stay on their respective sides. So he says the semi-loyal is the mystery. How does this play to January 6th? Well, I think the argument makes a lot of sense if you look at the objections made to the confirmation of eligible votes during the hearing on January 6th. The Senate hearing starts around 12 p.m., gets about an hour in, is interrupted by the attack, and then resumes around 8 p.m. During that, they have votes over the confirmation of different eligible votes from different states. There are 6 objections raised. So Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. There are no votes on 4 of those. There's an explicit move. It's very clear that the majority of the Senate is loyal to democracy in such a manner that they will not even raise these issues for discussion. There are 2 votes made, though. There are votes. There are votes in which roughly 60 Republicans vote to object to certification of ballots from 2 states. In Linz's model, January 6th does not succeed because not all Republicans vote to object to that certification. Because the majority of Republicans defect, and the majority of Republicans join the Democrats to reject that objection, democracy stays alive, right? Everything rested on the majority of Republicans breaking their party line and siding with Democrats. There's also a similar move made a year later, or roughly 6 months later, with the creation of the January 6th Committee, where 35 of 211 Republicans defect, and 2 Republicans defect from the party so much that they join the committee proper and they serve on it. This is again a move where the Republican Party proper breaks from the party line and joins the Democrats. In Linz's model, that's what saves everything. It's all about the Republicans that chose to uphold democracy. This requires that we position Republicans who have supported Trump over the 4 years, and especially someone like Mike Pence, as a savior of democracy, which conflicts with the earlier arguments we made about Trump somehow violating norms and having issues earlier in his career, or early in his political career. It creates a very odd sort of hero that saved democracy. So let's think about how democracy survives. I think there's at least 4 points that make a lot of sense here. The first is a very pragmatic issue. It's about the lack of effective strategy from Trump, Proud Boys, and the Oath Keepers. Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers were both far-right militia groups that were members of the they were part of the attacks on January 6th. You're going to hear is simply that regardless of the value orientations, regardless of the goals, Trump and his militias planned very badly. They did not understand how to properly take control of government. They actually got into the Senate. Attackers actually took up the gavel that was previously held by Mike Pence. They did not know what to do with it. There was not an effective way shown to seize the reins of power and to transform this into something else. This is just a practical issue. Right? The second argument is about the strength of the U.S. Constitution. So this goes back to the argument about the 12th Amendment. The Constitution and interpretation of the Constitution is so rock solid that someone trying to reinterpret it for anti-democratic means couldn't work. There was enough resistance to it to not allow that to happen, right? If the Constitution was more flexible, if there was more room in it for anti-democracy, then something like this could happen. The third argument is about the separation of state and military. In a lot of the Latin American cases we've seen, there is a history of the military coming in and seizing government control, or at least being a lot closer to the reins of power. In the U.S., that tradition doesn't exist. So there's less means for Trump to call in the military to do things like seize the voting machines. Trump is less able to work with Capitol Police officers and side them over to his cause. The Proud Boys and Oath Keepers aren't even a real paramilitary group. We have some paramilitary organizations in the U.S. The most obvious example is groups on the southern border of U.S. and Mexico that actually police the border. The Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers are not like that. They don't have that level of organization. They don't have that level of military control. They didn't have enough guns, right? The military isn't strong enough on this day. And the last argument, the argument I just talked about, is about the loyalty of semi-loyal Republicans. So the decision of Republicans who are in the center, oftentimes these are the never Trump Republicans, still hold up Republican values, don't like Trump, that choose the side of the Democrats. If Linz is trying to explain this, this is by far the most important. If I'm trying to explain it, I think these are deeply important. And Pence, again, is really important. So I think this is the explanation that we can get to with Linz. But I want to go one step further. I want to go back to the Wolford reading and think about representation. It's a very different argument. So if you remember the Wolford reading from the first week, Wolford's argument is that democracy has an empty place of power. This is his argument about how democracy avoids the temptation of totalitarianism, how it refuses to anchor any claim to power in a singular figure, and how it keeps open a sort of indeterminacy, a sort of incompleteness that allows for different people to make claims and have democratic contestation. The argument that he draws from that, though, is that there's impossibility of representation. We can't ever show what democracy looks like or what power looks like. So as a cultural sociologist, right, there's red flags in my head. How is that possible? Surely there has to be some other representation. And I think the Tocqueville reading that I gave you guys helps with that. Tocqueville's argument is that during elections, something very special happens, where the entire community sort of turns their attention to what's happening, to this battle between two figures, the fate of the nation. There's a moment, I think of this analysis by Tocqueville, sort of like a bone breaking. I think his argument is that democracy is like a bone that is never fully healed, that every 4 years is repeatedly broken, begins to heal, and then breaks again. And the argument about the election is specifically that the moment of the election is that moment of break. It's that moment where people sort of see what things can be and how things can be different. The argument that I want to make here is that January 6th does something very specific to resolve this issue raised by Wolford, which is that it represents democracy. So these are two newspapers that cover January 6th that show what happened during the attack. This image is really, really meaningful. This is an image of an attacker holding the gavel with consecrated safety. I think this shows democracy in its moment of attack. I think it allows us to see democracy as a target, see democracy in the words of the attackers, and to see a sort of representation in the untruth of the attackers' words. When the attackers say, "We are democracy, we're attacking this," we get a representation of democracy through their attack. We see what they're not saying, and we get some image of democracy. And I think even more importantly, so there's a representation that emerges in the moment of breakdown. But I think the really valuable, the really interesting thing about this is that democracy survives. That the breakdown doesn't happen, the coup doesn't succeed, and in the aftermath of the coup, democracy is able to define itself better by relating itself to the attackers. by saying we are not the attackers. We are diametrically opposed to their values, and thus that's what we are. By having a negative point of reference, democracy can say we are not that, and thus it gets definition. I think this is the exact same thing that happens in Brazil after the January 8th attack, where Lula's government is able to define itself because it has survived the attackers from Bolsonaro. Same thing here, where Biden's government gets to define itself because it survived the attacks by Trump. So again, this is a very different argument, but I think that this is the theory of what January 6th does, and potentially about what coups work generally do, about giving democracy some sort of representation. And maybe the broad claim here is that moments of democratic breakdown give a momentary representation of democracy, and especially survived moments of democratic breakdown allow democracy to anchor itself to achieve that figure of the one in reference to the attackers, in reference to the thing that is survived. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much. Point out, well, we already started our presentation for this first way. Wonderful. I wanted to start with this general medicus and then pick up two parts of your issues. So, the spectral breakdown, of course, one has to ask for the modalities of a possible breakdown, and I think one of the terms you've mentioned periodically, in fact, your last heading is about that, a coup. But usually, when we speak about coups, we have in mind an organization, generally the military or one possessing means of violence, that forcibly takes power against the legitimate power holders. In Spanish, at least, and I suspect in Portuguese there must be also an equivalent, there is a term, autogolpe, right? Self-coup, right? Is the English translation of it. So what we are possibly facing here, is an authority which is itself elected through the democratic system, which carries out an illegal, self-coup I think implies illegality, doesn't it? Or correct me if you, in your language the term comes up, an illegal way that a legal power holder, a legally authorized power holder, using illegal means to go beyond the Constitution and to grab power, either perpetuate his or to get power for someone else, usually it's on their own behalf. So Fujimori would be one classic example of an autogolpista. But I'm sure that you have examples of other presidents. I mean, you have so many coup attempts in Latin America. There are people who count these things. Some are of the first type, military coups. Others are of the second type. I think what we need to also, however, distinguish, and it's something that it is historically oriented works by people who are very much of the influence still of that earlier history. It's another modality. We sometimes call it a legal revolution, right? In other words, nothing strictly illegal occurs within a legal revolution. Nevertheless, the regime structure is decisively altered. I know on each one of these there's a debate. For example, in the case of Hitler, which is the most famous one, there's a debate. Was it legal? He was legally appointed chancellor through presidential government. But nevertheless, did he actually at a certain point carry out illegality? Carl Dietrich Bracher, to whom Lynch refers to, argued that at some point there is illegality. It had to do with the nature of the enabling act passed by rights. The enabling acts are legal, but what that enabling act did, again, the details of it, it changed the structure of government in such a way that was not permissible under the Weimar Constitution. So legal revolution would be a third type. It would still, the word revolution implies within it, right, the idea that something happens fast. What you'll see in this course, and I'm not going to suggest that we can describe Trump's 2016 to 2020 term quite in these terms, in spite of the fact that you got a list of, I don't know, how many illegalities or law-breaking things on his part. Nevertheless, I don't want to beg that question, but certainly now we are speaking about backsliding, de-democratization, turn from democracy, which is like the legal revolution in the sense that it is done in terms of formally legal acts, but it is long term. It is not, Hitler's, whatever the legal revolution in Hitler's case was, it occurs in basically 1933 to the very beginning of 1934, perhaps. So it's really less than a year. It's pretty rapid. And I would suspect that the basic changes already occurred in a few months. This backsliding, I think about backsliding, the metaphor, which we can't teach this kind of subject by metaphor, nevertheless implies many events, sliding. You go up the slide, you slide back. You go up the slide, slide back. Backsliding, but de-democratization too implies a process. And we are encountering these four at the very least, if you want to add something to them as a modality of collapse, you can add another. But I think that that's pretty exhaustive in terms of the possibilities. I don't think Linz and Stefan give a list of this type, but they work with that in the back of their mind. So the question with respect to this Trump effort would be, which one of these this was going to be? I mean, General Mattis is retiring right this moment, or at least giving up the Joint Chief office. There were soldiers around, but it's pretty clear that this is not going to be a coup by external force on behalf of either Trump or anybody else. Whether this was going to be an autogolpe, we can't really say, because we don't quite know what staying in power would have meant since it failed. We speak about it as backsliding, however, and that depends on how you evaluate the 4 years of Trump in office. Was there a long process already involved? Is this a combination of it? Was this something sudden that occurs? And I think that whatever that big list is that you're not sharing with us, this is a really pretty extraordinary attempt in relationship to those. So there is something which is not easy to compare to let's say Viktor Orban's or Kaczynski's efforts to de-democratize the backslide, to introduce more and more elements which create the right term for that is hybridity. Hybridization would be a term for this backsliding. That's actually the best term, hybridization. Whether you can speak about that in terms of Trump's previous activities, we can't say what would have happened had he actually managed this thing. But in any case, it's hard to classify. Of course, that maybe is it's a good thing, because the reason it's hard to classify is because it failed. What would it have been had it succeeded? Is really hard to say. So the first issue I want to raise is, did it completely fail? Right. You went to this discussion of of Lynn's, semi-loyalty, disloyalty, the number of people who wanted to literally overthrow and replace the American Constitution was small. You mentioned them and you say they were not very well organized and their military forces are. Okay, fine. But in any case, in this case, the number is really what is most striking. They represented a minority, a very small minority of American political spectrum. There are disloyal people probably in every democracy. There are fascist types around, there are authoritarians around. In the old days, today we would not even count them in this way. Communist parties were disloyal and they were large organizations, lots of places. But this is not what's relevant here, right? So you don't have a very powerful disloyal force, but there is a disloyal force. Now, one Lynn's would put the emphasis not on the disloyal, and it's really quite remarkable. Other people, I just read the book, reading a book by Manwaring and someone else, where he's again putting back the emphasis on the enemies of democracy. Once they can create a coalition large enough, then you can bring it down. I think the Lynn School and Lynn and Stefan are very persuasive on this, is that they say the really important category is the semi-loyal. Semi-loyalty is the important category. You did this, you stressed that. But now, within the spirit of Lynch, you said, well, it failed. So if the semi-loyal are the key, logically speaking, then it failed because the semi-loyal turned out to be loyal. That's what you said. I must say, it hasn't. I didn't feel that through the process, and I don't feel it still. But in terms of this explanatory scheme, yeah, I mean, the thing has to fail because the disloyal are too small, and they're always relatively small, and they're not getting sufficient support from the semi-loyal who are big, right? If the whole Republican Party could be described as that, and you didn't describe it that way, but if you take out Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney and 10 others, remember how many voted for impeachment, not just the first time, but even the second time. It's a very small number. You probably don't remember, 6 or 7. So it is the clearly loyal part is very small. I mean, he should have been impeached for this, right? That would have stopped him from. Well, the whole thing we're talking about, is he able to run for an election again now? That wouldn't come. Had he been impeached then, that would be by constitutional law. Should have been impeached, even to the extent that that he might not have done everything we imagined he did to facilitate this. He did enough, not to speak of writing stuff like that. So he should have been impeached. And the ones who voted for impeachment there, that strictly speaking loyal, are small. So the semi-loyal are big. And your thesis was, Adam, if I get you right, is that in the crunch, the semi-loyal turn out to be more loyal than semi. I mean, Mike Pence might be of that. They decided, no, this must stop and all the rest. Go ahead, yes.
It's very interesting when they make that decision, because they have the opportunity to make the decision when the electoral college votes are being counted. They begin to make that decision before the attack, and then they see the attack. They see the manifestation of what they could be supporting right before them. Right, they see they're literally under attack. They're ushered out.
So you're saying that they came close?
Yeah, they came close. Just barely, they see it.
I mean, hang Mike Pence perhaps did not help the Trump cause when you have slogans of this type. But you say they came close. But nevertheless, your argument is that in the end they proved to be on the loyal side, because semi, by almost definition, means a very high degree of tolerance for the disloyal. It doesn't mean the semi-loyal become disloyal, but they facilitate disloyalty. And this, in the end, in this case, you say it did not. Now, my question was, and maybe my discussion can stop with this, since everybody knows this particular case. It's interesting how you put it in terms of time. In time A, they could have become disloyal. Then in time B, they turned to be loyal after all. And then what about time C? because you're seeing all these people, not just the impeachment vote. What was the day when they voted, when Senate votes on the impeachment? This event is the 6th of January. It must have been very close to it. By that time, they don't vote for it, right? And I think even more seriously, the subsequent development of the party. I mean, the thing that one of the articles I just read now, you gave me several to read, and I'm not sure exactly how I read it, but one of them starts out with the debate, the Republican debate, where the questioner says, if he's convicted for a crime, would you allow him, or would you vote for him being able to nevertheless run and win? And only two people whom I hardly even mentioned as candidates because they're so insignificant said no, and the rest of them all raised their hands yes. So that, of course, means that the shift toward disloyalty could be again occurring. And that's why I asked whether Trump won. He didn't win being kept in office at that particular moment. Probably could not have been done given all the factors in the United States. And after all the states have national guards. The military is mostly enlisted people. They were not going to pull that off in that way. But I think a more serious consequence is the growth of disloyalty, and that means that it's possible that the Republican Party as a whole. I mean, after all, if they're going to pick him as the candidate, not just put their hands up in a weird situation in a debate, which could have been reluctant. They all kind of looked around, whatever it is. But if they actually pick him, then campaign for him and put him back into office, then the question is whether the semi-loyals have become really very close now to being themselves disloyal. So we're still in this crisis. The crisis is not over because we don't quite know how it's going to turn out. But the problem is the party. And I think, well, what was the name of one of the articles you gave out? I don't know where it was published. That always needs enablers, which is a Lynchian point about it always needs the semi-loyal acting disloyally. That is always the crucial thing. And that trend, the question is, where is that trend? Where is that trend headed? And I think it's not easy to know the answer because we're in the midst of a campaign. In all the polls, he is 30 points ahead of the next challenger. DeSantis, who was the next one, is falling. So at the moment, he's becoming stronger and stronger. And given what we now know, and of course, all the things that you're putting on the board are in the public domain. I mean, the Republican politicians know that. They know this, and they know what the attempt now was. And so, to that extent, they accept this candidacy. And it's not just the constitutional issue, 14th Amendment, which would be, I think, probably sufficient. Some lawyers think it is quite sufficient to exclude him anyway because he was engaged in an insurrection. But there's also the non-formal issue, but I don't know all the countries in the world that are represented in a group. Probably you could say that lots of countries where being convicted of a crime like that disqualifies you.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that would be pretty normal.
You mean legally or socially? Because I think there's this thing. I mean, in Brazil, for instance, we have law that prohibits convicted people in second instance.
Right.
That's one.
Right.
But then there's the question of latitude.
Well, that too, of course. But I would say that those are two steps which are important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this sense, even if we don't have such a law in the U.S., and we don't on ordinary crimes, we do have an insurrection, but unclear whether that applies. from point of view of legitimacy, it would be pretty abnormal for somebody who's convicted of several crimes, right?
But it seems to be what happened to Trump, right? From what polls show, that there's no rejection.
No,
from the
no.
public based on convictions.
Not from them, not from them, not from them. But I mean, there is a political class. There are, there's a judicial system. There are all kinds of things around, and that would be. But I think that the central variable is that he captured this party, and if that,
This was supposed to sort of, the Republican Party, show them the sense that in your explanation.
well, apparently it did not work. And some explanation. I mean, I'm just watching that, you can't say much that is that positive about any of their candidates. But I mean, you have relatively normal ones who are not accused of crimes and who have not participated in insurrection. So one would think maybe one of them should have some kind of chance, but apparently not. So it means that now, okay, sociologically, one could say which part of the party is it the politicians or is it the base, and how those two are interacting, because the politicians are, after all, cynical people, and if they saw the base was totally rejecting this type of anti-American activity, they would shift. On the other hand, the fact that you see so many senators cover for this and Congress people, you were raising, or you were, yeah.
Yes, actually.
Yeah, let's have a discussion, right?
So isn't it?
Right.
Part of the breakdown too.
Well, the thing is that so far, me more than Adam stayed within this Lynch paradigm, right? And of course, if you go beyond the paradigm, then the two natural things to ask about are not the political actors, which is what we've been discussing now, but you would naturally ask questions about the economy, and you would naturally ask about cultural tension in society, which is what we were addressing. Well, the economy, it's funny that the United States has responded to the COVID crisis probably as well or better than most industrial countries. So that should be a plus, but it isn't. This is a huge minus, which allows people to mobilize. I would go with you that it's the cultural background of this, which is really, really significant, is that there is really in that Trump base, this of course I think surveying could study the view that is usually represented as a white supremacist, but which probably could be better represented as people caught in a status crisis, some kind of status crunch, some kind of threat to their inherited idea of who they are and what their place in American society is, that must be pretty heavy. So everybody kind of knows it's more men than women, and though there are obviously some African Americans and some people from Spanish Latin background and so on who are in this Trump strong base, the big majority are well, white is a very bizarre term anyway, right? But are people of European ancestry. That's what one can say. It's kind of weird, right? Because looking at the Latin American in this room, I would say you are all of European ancestry, right? With his name, with his Flemish name, and all the rest. I mean, and so your German name, right? But in any case, these are the terms you use, and we somehow make that distinction because ridiculous in terms of history and sociology. But still, probably one could say that there is such milieu, and that's the heart of it somehow. And you know, as absurd as it may seem to everybody in this room, but nevertheless, Trump addresses them. He addresses them, and in a way mobilizes them, and we'll see a lot of this now. We'll see how much there is. I mean, that brings it brings me to the book that we just wrote last year, my wife, on populism, which is, of course, a pretty broad term to talk about all kinds of political trends. But I think that one could say that Trump has made a pretty convincing pitch to occupy the space of a populist leader. It goes along with what you had Lefort on the board, right? Interestingly, I thought that the Lefort and the Tocqueville quotes go against one another. Is that how you thought it?
Yes.
No, I thought there was a conflict between them.
Yeah, I think you're used.
And I think Alexis de Tocqueville might have been the better sociologist. Lefort was a friend of mine, but Alexis de Tocqueville may have been the better sociologist. What does Lefort say, right? Democracy is when the space of power, which was held by the king with his famous two bodies, right? You know, all that beautiful stuff, two bodies of the king. Democracy, the space is a form, but no one takes that space that the king in the semi-theological, semi-secular status used to occupy. So it's empty. It's empty. And what does Tocqueville say? Tocqueville say elections. It was great that you recommended that the text of Tocqueville. That elections are a crazy time for each of these. You know, it's like Lefort didn't ask the question: is this the same in the moment of elections? Is this the same in normal time? You know, in a crisis and all the rest. You know, and I think that Lefort too has room in his theory to say, after all, think about the French Revolution, which he has written wonderful things on. There are moments when someone tries to occupy that space. I would say, whereas Lefort tended to think that is, in a way, a mark of totalitarianism, I think totalitarianism could be a version of it, but I think populism, strictly speaking, is the attempt to occupy that space, right? In other words, I mean, look how they talk, and you see this in Hugo Chavez, you see it in Trump, you see it in lots of places where somebody says, they're attacking me, but they're really attacking you because I'm your voice, I'm speaking for you. So attacking me is really attacking you. And this idea that my body is now in the place of where the king's body was is a way of trying to occupy the space. Now, does anybody occupy it in a democracy successfully? Well, it's hard to say because these things, after all, are themselves challengeable and they don't last forever. But that the attempt is made, and I think that attempt is being made by him, and the election was the moment, because if I am you, voting me out is illegitimate. Whatever the numbers actually say, it's not legitimate. The people cannot be removed from power, and removing me means the people would be removed from power. And so he is, in fact, exploiting a possibility within the democratic imaginary. And I think that's what we're going to see, whether that can be done. And, you know, one can say it's already been done because for a very large number of people, it seems to be working. But on the other hand, in terms of political institutional change, it hasn't worked. What happens if he's reelected? Please, now let's open the floor. I took
I wanted to take a couple of things regarding the incentive model and how you said it doesn't account for popular opinion. Luis also said in the presentation about Chile that it doesn't account for all of the structural factors. I mean, I guess that what I would say is also, I think that Trump was so successful in getting elected and getting like so many votes, also because of the historical circumstances that he's dealing with, right? It's not like I guess that if he would run in a time where there wasn't so much white fear of losing this status
Right.
of a white predominant society, that he would not be as successful because we had seen people like I don't know, he's not even as radical as someone like George Lincoln Rockwell or David Duke, or but they didn't have this circumstance in which there's so much demographic change that's where the base really starts like garnering support. And also the other question that I had was I also thought that in the article by Levitsky and Siblat, which was actually before January 6th, I didn't know how much the electoral system is like biased towards rural areas that also include this kind of like favorable conditions
Right.
for those. So I think that that is also a structural political factor that also allows him to have more of this power with the semi-loyals that would not necessarily have if it was here differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's clear, and it's a gap, not so much in the collective work of Litz and Stefan, but the earlier discussion, the kind of gap that the active perspective is so important that the context, which generally, I mean, in the left, we always talk about crises, right? That's the context within which these things can happen. But crises can come in very different forms and need not be economic. For example, immigration crisis. I mean, I was trying to think as you were speaking of exactly which change circumstance would be the most salient to this. And I think we have to say immigration, not because, by the way, in the U.S. There is a actual crisis. The number of people who will still be accepted and employed and integrated in the society is still much, much larger than anything that we're likely to get in the short term. But people think so. So the perception that people are coming, they're different than we are, it's going to take our jobs, they are threatening, and of course, criminality is always imagined also. I think that this is, of course, now we'd have to study the election of what extent Trump is using it. But certainly this is going to be what we're going to be talking about now. Yeah, please.
Trump, as a so technically, African and Native. So the monetary didn't capture the relative degradation. So in my opinion, like you're talking about, I think democracy, but in my opinion, I believe like, it's not it's 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 one of the first democracy. And of course like violence not be just not never be justifiable, but I wanna plot the difference here to disagree with that like policy yeah, relate all the whole. So I think those conflicts is represent the the deprivation like that. And also there's already yeah, and also at the moment the article yeah, we have been overrepresented, but I think if overrepresentation matters, like the electoral college, right? Like overrepresentation matters. You have to think about the Senate and House overrepresentation because when they're not really represent the population exactly because they're highly educated or they are selected. They're not like random sampling, but they are overrepresented. But we respect example for their members because they care about if we like we really random sampling or if we really represent the whole population, that the exact ratio there is the population that always the majority. I'm not the good.
So the term that keeps on coming back in your comments is representation. Adam had this thing, which I think we need to actually interrogate him on, who as representation. But before we get to that, there is, first of all, implicit in what you're saying is that there's lots of misrepresentation or poor representation in the American system. And that means that electoral college, right? I mean, to some extent, it is structured in such a way that that somebody who is not does not have the vote of the majority wins nonetheless. The Senate even more misrepresentative in terms of number, right? Because small states, very small states get the same number of senators as very large ones. So you could say that the American system has serious flaws of representation built into it. That could be debated in an intelligent way by people who believe in federalism, who could say that that's the price is paid for having a system which is federal. In other words, allowing for different units to participate in the same overall political system, which they would not want to or could if indeed it was one person, one vote going down the line. But we don't have to debate that issue. If there is misrepresentation on that level, then we can say that this democracy as a whole is flawed. There are other flaws as well. Direct democratic elements are relatively weak and all the rest, but still, let's just stay with the formal system for a moment. Now, the strangeness of this particular episode is that it's the people who are the beneficiaries of both of these forms of misrepresentation, right? Both the Electoral College and the Senate are the ones who are rebelling against the actual outcome of the system, even Hillary beat him by 3 million votes, right? Biden, it looks like, beat him by 7 million votes. So it's kind of bizarre, right? If you actually think about what was going on, is that people are militantly fighting and organizing and committing illegal acts on behalf of what is clearly a minority. Now, you could say if you really have a racist theory or or some other sociologically tenable theory of who is represented, it is even if the numbers are right, if you just counted the vote of white men, white European origin men, Trump would have won. I doubt even if that's the case, that is, if you actually total even that vote, whether he would have won, because 7 million is a pretty big number. But in any case, that would be some kind of aristocratic principle that we have a special right to be represented and we're not on equal basis with anybody else. So, in a way, it's a peculiar struggle over representation. The system has a lot of flaws of representation. But the people who are benefiting from those flaws are rebelling against the system because they can't accept a defeat, even given that system. So that brings me to the point that I was going to ask: coup as representation, because that would mean if you can operate your scheme. If you ask me, I wouldn't be able to do it, but he'll be able to do it. Look at him. He did it. All right. I don't know how the Lafleur and the Tocqueville quotes explain that.
So this argument is less about traditional forms of political representation, so having your voice in the government. It's much more about an image of democracy, like what democracy looks like.
It cannot be represented.
Yeah, but I think my argument is that coup very uniquely makes democracy representative. Because it demonstrates what democracy looks like in the attacker's words, right? The attacker says the flawed democracy. We recognize the attacker as untrue. So we see the untrue, we see the image of democracy in its version. We hear their words as untrue, so we in them. And then when the attack fails, when democracy survives, democracy is able to define itself by saying, we are not this.
By negation.
By negation. We are the opposite of what these attackers are doing. So democracy becomes that building. Democracy becomes an empty seats. Democracy becomes the structures. And this is a partial claim, but I think it's a partial claim that's very democratically justified. Insofar as it projects the immorality of the attack. Right? The whole thing rests on just how bad the attack was. Without the attack, we're stuck in the problem.
I mean, it's not an entirely unfamiliar argument from history of thought, right? I mean, think about Marx's notion of universal class, right? It's the proletariat is not everybody. At the time he wrote it, it was every country was a minority. They were peasant countries mostly. Nevertheless, he attributes some kind of, to use your term now, representation quality to that universal class. Universal human interest is Marx. I deliberately citing Marx because you want to kind of make sense of this, and if you don't take somebody who actually thought something like this so seriously, you can't. Right? A coup is a representation. No, it's the opposite side. How can you actually think of it? Now think about revolution in a Marxian sense, right? I mean, Marx never himself thought that revolution would be the act of a minority. But by the time you get to Lenin and the idea of the vanguard, you're almost there. And so people are misrepresented by the liberal Democrat. Why am I producing Marxist arguments to support this shit? Well, in order to kind of understand the logic of thinking, and in the end, that we reject that logic of thinking, even in its left version. But I think it's worth presenting it because otherwise, in these people, you can never find, an ounce of intelligence to actually explain what your very provocative thing here says, right? But you can find it in the history of thought. Because you can see if human interest would be, a communist society, a completely different type of arrangement of everything. And then the people, unfortunately, have false consciousness and keep on voting for bourgeois politicians or reformist politicians, well, then somebody has to speak in their name. So this modality of thought, uh, which never made Marx into a putschist or somebody in coups, but Lenin, comes closer. October 1917. My friend Agnes Scheller, the professor here. No, she used to say it was a coup.
Yeah.
Agnes used to call it a coup. I hesitate to do that, but you can see the point because it occurred in some cities, right, by people who possessed the means of violence, and then in the end it was they had to fight a civil war against much of the rest. But you see the point, right? Is that what on the right they are implying is, and this is I think is what I call populism in the generic form, is that there's better ways of speaking for the people than to actually run through this election. Now Trump, uses the peculiar form of saying the election either didn't happen or it did happen, and the result was not what everybody sees the result. He kind of tries to do a kind of factual, but what would it happen in the U.S. You say if he would have said, "Forget the election, I'm your voice, put me back to power." Yeah, go ahead.
And I think there's a different answer to this problem. If you take seriously Trump's populist challenge, you take seriously the happens on January 6th, I think you can demonstrate the possibility of of the people actually entering into Congress, actually seeking the gavel, actually taking back their needs. So the moment
We used to, I hate to attack the left too much, but we used to do it. We were on the street and we would say, "We are the people." That slogan was on the left, was said by a lot, right? And of course, one could argue sometimes it's legitimate. The mobilized really are expressing what everybody can show is, but sometimes it's not. Yeah, Louis.
No, I mean, I have a hard time in really taking seriously the Genesis. For me to think of it as a coup,
He's Argentinian.
Yeah, we have like 10 days before that, before January 6th, you have all the living former Pentagon chiefs writing an opinion note saying we're not going to support any breach of the 11th German.
Exactly.
I mean, the military was. I mean, it's not that order didn't get sent out. I mean, the military was no way near. And it's very hard for me to see it. I mean, we've had many times storming the Congress of Argentina or storming, and those were not coups. Like we were just disorganized people or whatever.
I've been reading in Argentina, and of course in other places too, but Argentina most recently, one of the main warring chapters on Argentina, you had a lot of coup attempts that didn't succeed also, right? So you have, probably since the Second World War, 4 or 5 that succeeded, right? But there were lots of other ones that did not. Even Chile, before the Pinochet coup, there were a couple of attempts. So you have failed coups too, right? Failed coups are part of this history. Now, I don't mean to disagree with you. This is a comic event. On some level, you're trying to say, come on, we know what a coup is. This is comical.
I understand this was representation, but the effect in terms of what comes after that. I mean, of course, we can discuss it, and there's clearly a right-wing, a crazy branch of the Republican Party, and the mutation of the Republican Party. And I think those are all pretty real and incredibly dangerous things that are going on. But I think the response to January 6th from the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, is sort of an abstract defense of democracy, which I mean, I at least I would argue just feeds into these crazy people. I mean, there was representing this as a coup is really not it's just not doesn't state the facts. I mean, no fraction of the military was going to support this. The National Association of Manufacturers, like the biggest bourgeois association in the country, they immediately repudiated the coup. The trading, I can't remember the name of the association, but the one that represents the traders like Wall Street and all that also repudiated. Like, I mean, it's hard for me to think of the possibility of a coup without ruling class support and without military support. So I don't know.
Moreover, you can add the criteria which some of this group of political scientists developed, is that you need some kind of pretty broad authoritarian coalition behind it.
Yeah.
So, we hate to admit this, right? But yeah, of course, Allende was still the candidate of perhaps the majority, not a very large one ever, but still. And the people who supported the coup were much smaller than that, but it's a significant number. So you need, you kind of say, well, these people should have been Washington, but what was it, 2,000 people in this enormous country. So I think that there's good reason to do what you do. And given the comparative nature of this course, it has to happen. Is that, you say, and he's Argentinian, so I think it's a particularly, I don't know if Argentina had the most coups in Latin American history, but probably, if not the first, then the second. I would say probably first, right? So you have really a distinguished history of these things, and you know what they're like. And even the failed ones come closer, right? Because the failed ones at least represented one garrison revolting, some officers, so the failed ones could have grown and could have become. And this was, but still, I think that we have to see that that this even happened at all. And then subsequently that the Republican Party does not radically repudiate it, but on the contrary is about to run on it, is because, I don't want to say this after, when was the Chilean transition is 88, 89, I guess since the 90s. I don't know if there are any coups, successful coups anywhere in the 90s and after, certainly not Argentina, right? There were a couple of times to the military discontent and so on, but nothing, So maybe coups is no longer the way to actually look at it, right? Look at de-democratization. And it could be that this weird event, to the contrary, we're going to have to focus more on what is happening now, in terms of erosion, in terms of deinstitutionalization, in terms of weakening of the what they call the guardrails. That's the term, right? And so on. The guardrails are weakened. Lynch calls them the arenas, right? Everybody has different metaphors. Arenas of democratization, civil society, political society, the rule of law, all the rest, economic society. Well, in the United States, you would say that the guardrails, from Lynch's point of view, are pretty strong. You would say they're pretty strong. And the one thing which is a problem is political society, because one of the major parties, is it disloyal? Well, that's, I think, too much to say, but it is certainly semi. That's the point. Loyalty would have meant, Mitt Romney could vote for impeachment twice. So, you looked at what he did. The second time certainly should have been impeached and, convicted on the impeachment. Yeah. And then please go around the room. I should stop talking so much.
Because I like your argument a lot. I agree with most of it. I think we've really confused. I think if you locate January 6th in the US, it makes more different things to do. Insofar as the by far the most true-like event of the summer after US history, which then maybe it calls us to say, okay, something proper. It's going in the direction where it has coup-like elements. And if the labeling of it as a coup helps us identify those as an alien. The second thing is that I think you're right to notice just how quickly people denounce the coup, just how little support there is. But this is forgetting how exceptional those 6 hours long UPMs, and just how uneasy and unsure people are, just how much support there is for genuinely keeping children comfort. And then there is the anti-youth, but I think there's a moment where there is this use for youth. And I think the third point is to consider, okay, if we don't hold a coup, if we still think it's very important, what do we think about it? What do we understand politics? And the other major frame, the other way of thinking about it in a lot of US politics is undeniable terrorism. Is that undeniable violent terrorism that puts it in 9/11, except the inside, it puts it in the context like this, the 2017 war. I'm curious what you think about that. I think that's a little bit or you think those taken too seriously. To me, I want to find taken seriously. Who does that in the best way? I think something like terrorism, which I see as one of the other major approaches, gets a lot of things wrong. It's things much worse. Like it things much more wrong.
No, I don't think, terrorism thing is, and also because of the constant terrorism, can emerge from this. But also, like if these were not white men and they were black, this could be
With their difference.
what is going to happen? Like the charges of insurrecting against these guys. I mean, I'm in favor of putting them to jail, but at the same time, it opens like a whole series of stuff, like against the Black Panthers, where like what they did was, I don't know. So it's hard to think, but I don't know. I mean, for me, it's like I don't know. People use pooch instead of poo, like sort of like a beer on pooch. I mean, I think it's much more similar. I mean, pooch is cool.
I was gonna say autogolpe or self-coup, because I mean, you immediately go to the military, so that you could show that there's no coup at all because there's no military support for it and so on. But a self-coup would have a different logic, and especially, these arguments. I mean, you think that the lawyers make up all kinds of stupid arguments which are absurd, and this thing that you put on the board and other claims that Trump's lawyers have made. So many people say they're fallacious that we kind of think of them as comical. But, in a way, a self-coup, which is a legal, successfully represented as a legal turn in the power relations, leading to change. What if Mike Pence would have actually gone along with this? I mean, he is not the kind of person anyone in this cast is going to like very much, right? Religious fundamentalist, very sexist, and all the rest. But he did not go along with this, right? What if he did? What if Mike Pence would have been like Rudy Giuliani? Yeah, see, this is the thing: is that supports Louis' interpretation. I mean, Rudy Giuliani's behavior to the whole thing was comical. Right, so it's kind of this is sort of the Argentine perspective. The whole thing becomes comical. Well, that's another problem. Is that he is whatever anybody said about I don't know about your guys Viola Videla, but Pinochet certainly stays in my mind, and no one ever thought he was comical.
Yeah, that's Bolsonaro.
Well, Bolsonaro has Right. Bolsonaro does have the comical aspect. He does have it. He does.
And it's such a Farsace.
By the way, I just read a piece, now where I read it, which compares the way that the Brazilian political elite responds to Bolsonaro and the Republicans to Trump. And the Brazilian elite comes out very much in favor, very much better. That they are not putting up, they're not covering, they're not enabling, they're not saying retrospectively that any of us this was I could be wrong. I don't know where I read it.
You mean the political would be?
Well, what about his own party, Bolsonaro's own party?
The party?
Yeah. Did they support his claims about some of the election not being right or whatever?
Yes, that's actually
But it's not a two-party system in its own way.
It's a lot of parties, and right now it's the supporting center. It's the really,
Right, right.
In Portuguese, it has been called centrão, which is kind of a superlative term, which is center, like big center.
Right.
And Bolsonaro, his party, the PL, it's the party with the most seats in the House
Right now?
right now, followed by the Workers' Party for President.
Right.
And PL, Bolsonaro's party, was the strongest in supporting his anti-election claims, which happened not only to the public, but also legally by petitioning to the Brazilian Supreme Court. And that process only stopped when the Brazilian Supreme Court fined the party on legal basis of not sure how to say this in English, but kind of unlawful petitioning in a huge value that was calculated on the basis of how much the voting urns cost and what it would cost to actually recount the votes every year. So this was such a huge fine that blocked the party's access to the public funding for political.
They couldn't afford to go on.
That they couldn't afford to do anything.
Right.
So this
Would
was
he be a candidate for them again?
not right now, because the Brazilian Electoral Supreme Court ruled that he would be ineligible for
Okay,
the next,
so-
for the next 8 years.
Right.
So this is Bolsonaro's position.
Well, we're not there yet in the US, right?
They haven't done that.
We're not there with the US, with the courts have ruled against Trump on the narrow issue of this actual election. But no one has any opinion on the constitutional question of his running again. And he's being they're running him. I mean, obviously, it's kind of bizarre because he doesn't go to their debates.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Bolsonaro did-
But he gains from that.
Exactly, Bolsonaro did exactly the same thing. Which is one way of
Yeah, you go ahead. Well, it's a good comparison anyway.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think just on the point of presentation that we have going. I think we can think of January 6th as a kind of violent public performance of deinstitutionalization sense. But now there is the meaning of the performance as a public act, but there's also the meaning of the performance and the political action, and so far as it interacts with the structural process. Right? So I think that would be the difference between Black Panthers and these protestants, because one is in a democratization sense, right? And the other one is in a deep democratization sense. But I think it might it's very provocative to put it as a group as representation. But I think that this kind of public manifestation produces images that are very important for the consolidation, the formation of political communities. So just as the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times might put these images up to say this is not democracy, and then go to the kind of a clean-cut, right, account of what democracy is, which I agree that only feeds into the public atmosphere that bourgeois democracy is not real democracy. So we must storm the Capitol in order to seize symbols of power, to take the gavel, even though we have no idea what to do with it, because we're only regular people.
Yeah.
We're the common man.
Well, that's what certainly that voting base, that's what they think.
Exactly.
And
So
the more
I think-
New York Times and more the Washington Post attacks,
Exactly,
that all-
only feeds into their
that feeds
logic,
into their understanding.
into their logic of community formation, which is reliant on images, as every community.
But
is,
also sense of injury, because we're being excluded.
Exactly.
We did this and look how they treat us, look how they exclude us.
Exactly.
They're
So,
speaking as if it didn't even matter.
yeah, so I think there's a really which, right, so I think the very interesting point that we can make here on the interpretation of the event relating to broader theoretical aspects is a point that you brought up right at the beginning, right before you talked about Hillary Clinton's, body of discourse video. Is that a reflection on the relationship between egalitarianism and democracy, which I think kind of relates also to the episode concerning harassment of election work and the paramilitary status of groups such as Proud Boys. They're not paramilitary groups in kind of a classical Latin American sense, right? That they have the organization and the training and all of that. But there is this kind of individualized possibility of microaggression, right? That can be kind of materialized under the phenomenon of gun access and gun policies. In Brazil, it's just the same. And I was just going through the book, the insurrection book, and I saw it was a really shocking image. It was a father just taking care of his son, and it was kind of this tender image of father-son masculinity. And the father had a shirt that said "Black Guns Matter." So I think there's this kind of deconcentration of violence from being in a paramilitary organized group to just being, spread around society in basic day-to-day interactions that kind of can maybe be basis for interpretation of this kind of erosion of the relation between egalitarian and democracy. Because I think what might be at play from a cultural point of view, but taking in consideration the economic neoliberal and political broader spectrum, the Escadivas that we're commenting on, is that there is this kind of inequality effect that erodes on the egalitarian value system, which might be useful to interpret, what puzzles me the most, what I think is the main problem, is the huge popular support for Trump, right? Because there's nothing that the political system can do, there's nothing that the GOP can do going against that kind of massive popular support, right? These might be limits of an autonomous view of the political system. So I think there's this kind of relation between society and the state that is mediated by the set of individual values and practices. There's this kind of state of individualism, right? That kind of would be what I would ask you.
Maybe respond to this. Yeah, go ahead. This is an interesting question.
Get to closing.
Yeah. This is an odd note to close on because it's very different than what we talked about before. Part of me wants to stand with Clinton's and say that egalitarianism is not the important foundation of democracy, and this is a side issue, and it's much more about behaviors. Part of me wants to say that cut access is a secondary issue that empirically most popular January 6th have guns. That this, like many issues about masculinity, I'm not sure. I think you're generally correct that this helps explain why people are utilized in specific. I think it fails to explain how you get quite this violent, why there's this much rage, why the attack is done in this particular way. I'm not sure. I'm really just not sure. I need to think on it longer. I know that's a horrible note to end, but I'm not exactly sure what to say to your comment. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to watch Trump, because if you're right, he's going to alter his approach to some extent. I mean, you must realize instinctively that he's beating all these traditional Republicans, right? That can't be the winning ticket anymore. That is, up till now, at various moments, he had to make concessions to them on issues, on economic issues, social issues. I mean, this strike right now, he's sort of tempted. Biden's going further. Biden's going to join the picket line, which is, I think, a very good move in this setting. This is a terrific move. But Trump will also go there and give a speech in Michigan to auto workers. So he is getting close to really respond to much deeper forms of discontent than the typical Republican issues that, taxes are too high or government interferes in our lives too much or whatever. So I think it'd be interesting to see where he takes it, because if he, he didn't have this party in 2016 in the same way. He went through. I'm not sure of the numbers now in the various primaries. He beat them, but he didn't beat them overwhelmingly. Now, but now his numbers are 30, 40. It's over. But he's been president, so that, of course, makes him a symbolic figure more important. Plus, January 6th becomes mobilizing for them, as much as we may not think so. That's what you're saying, is that this is a symbolic event, which is cathartic for one part of the population. So he's gaining. But what is he going to do with that gain? And I think we have all good reasons to believe that if he's elected, he's going to be bad for political democracy. That is a pretty good hypothesis. But I mean, where he's going to take it. Okay, so you please, then you'll be the last.
Yeah.
Just trying to make sure I hear you.
For me, I'm not married.
Yeah.
Nothing other than that's from he made after that event, like media topics, they're becoming retracted. Their democracy is failed, like populism, or because of the uneducated, ruler, like white Americans. But that, but I think that is also the kind of democracy isolating, which excludes the other members.
Well, that's for
Not-
sure.
Yeah, which does not embrace all, and actually which does not point out the problem, like real problem, like representative matters. Yeah.
Well, this is certainly going to be an effect that, it's a strange thing to say in the new school, right? It's almost, at least in my classes, almost everybody's from abroad, including me. But I think that this is going to be a time when that's going to be tense. And even if he loses, it's going to be tense. New York City, of course, is not a place where they have strength. But still, the feeling of hostility and exclusion, and to some extent culturally, racially based, that's going to be the effect. because that's the part, maybe in these pictures we can see it, but I think the chances of seeing a black or brown face in the crowd that is in those pictures are not good. I don't exclude the possibility he gets some voters and so on, but on the whole, this is going to be very divisive in the cultural, racial. I don't know about religion. He's such a poor leader for Christianity.
This is where Mike Pence comes in. Where Mike Pence.
Yeah, but he's not going to run with Mike Pence no more.
Mike Pence is the perfect other candidate.
Yeah,
Lots of Christian voters.
yeah, but he's not getting it. They're going with because they have theological reasons for going with the one who is going to destroy the evil system more.
We don't like the fact.
Thank you very much. Really good discussion. I appreciate everybody's contributions. They're really good, and the presentation was very good. So we'll go on. Let's remember that you're going to be 2 weeks from now, not next week. Not
Instead, only 2 weeks of that, can I?
you're going to be 3 weeks from now.